If you want to be able to interact with your application and perform the tasks which you have set on the screen, we need to add actions and outlets to the objects within that interface builder. Now what these actions and outlets do is be able to control the objects on the screen. For example, if we added an action to a button, basically actions are what enable us to trigger objects to perform tasks. Outlets is then what displays the information triggered by the action on the screen. For example, we'll add an action to a button to trigger it to perform an action. And then an outlet such as a label, which is this here. I'll just space it out. There we go. So if we select the button to trigger the action, let's say the action is to display text, our label, which will have an outlet on it, will then be the outlet to display that text from within it. So the action performs the action, the outlet displays the action, so to speak. And we're going to be finding out now how to create these actions and outlets. Now there's two ways to do to basically create actions and outlets. There's through an assistant editor, which is handy, very quick and easy to use, or we can create those manually. So I'm going to be showing you both of these ways. Now we have a button and a label. The button will need an action for us to perform and trigger some kind of task for it to perform, and the label will be obviously the outlet which will display the information. So how we do this is I'll just drag it over to the left, click on our assistant editor here at the top, there we go, and make sure that this is selected within our view controller.h. So even if it's not the view controller, if it's a different view, always make sure that when you're adding actions and outlets in, that you're adding them within the .h of the view. Now it's very simple to create an action or an outlet. All you need to do is right click or control click and drag the button or the label over and place it just before the end of our view controller.h, and then drop it in. The connection, we're going to start with creating an action. It's on outlet by default. We're going to give it a name, so I'll simply name it action button. Type is ID. The event by default is set as touch up inside. Now the event is how we trigger or basically interact with the object. So as it's by touch up inside by default, that means we're simply going to touch the button, and as soon as our finger comes off the button, the action is then triggered. We could do touch down. This means as soon as our finger touches the button, it triggers. We don't need to take it off. There's stuff like touch drag inside, touch drag exit. There's value changed. There's editing did on end on exit. Now most of these actions or events here don't really work with a button, but they get placed all there ready. So when you select one of the objects to perform an action on, we have different ones to work with. And we're working with different one of these when we come to working with different objects further on in the course. So by default, we're going to make sure it's on touch up inside and argument sender. Now you can choose to have the sender or none. We're going to keep the sender on by default. If you take it off, it's only just by doing simple stuff like displaying text or anything like that. Or if you keep it on, it's like requiring more information, such as if you're switching views or anything like that further, more in depth. And we'll get onto that further on in the course. But all by default, I'm going to leave it as it is. The only thing we're going to change is the action and the name and connect that up. And then once we connected that up, you'll see if we go to our connections inspector, that we have an action button, which we named it, we called it here action button, has now got a link here, and if you hover over it, it says that it's linked up to our button. And once we created it in there, it automatically generates it within our view controller.m. So we're now ready to place code in between the two parentheses curly brackets there, so when we interact with our button, it can perform whatever action we've set it to do. So back into our main.storyboard, and we can do the same now for our label. And we drag and drop it underneath. And again, by default, it's selected as outlet, so we'll simply name it label. And the options we have here is to change the storage from strong to weak. By default, it's on weak. Anytime I have it, it was handling more data with the label, maybe saving the data, maybe it needs to hold itself within the view. But by default, it's selected as weak, so we connect that up. And again, in the connections inspector under the outlet section, our label is now placed in. But the difference is with a label, it doesn't reference itself within our .m. Now we don't need to do that because it's not an action, it's just ready in there, so we could type stuff like, if we typed out our label, self.label, it's there ready for us to work with. So we've got it there ready, so it's not set in there just like our button, but it's ready to be referenced in there. Now there's sometimes some objects require you to have both an action and an outlet on them. And these objects, for example, I'm going to show you with our segment control. Now the reason we'll have an action and an outlet on a segment control is because A, we need the action to perform and trigger something when we do it, but we need an outlet because as the segment control has two options, first and second, we need to, if I create an action, call it segment control, and make sure that's an action. And you'll notice now that the event is not touch up inside, it's value changed. This is because it will get performed when the value of our segment control is changed. So we connect that in. But how does it know that the value of our segment control is changed? And that's by simply creating an outlet for it too. So if I pull it segment outlet, connect that up. So when we go to, let's close the assistant editor, go to our viewcontroller.m, we have our action here. And what's going to happen, basically, when we interact with our segment control, we're going to press it, one of the tabs on it, and it's going to perform the action. But the action it needs to perform is if one of these segments control, if the value of our segment control is changed, where we reference it from the outlet, then perform the action. So these are the type of objects that require you to have an action and an outlet on them. But this object and many of the more that can need those, we talk about further on in the course, where we perform simple tasks and get them to be created in some of the apps that we create further out in the course. But that's simply how you create an action or an outlet through using the assistant editor. Now also a second way of doing this is doing it manually. And by doing it manually, we send it to our viewcontroller.h where we can type it out. So it's very simple to do it manually. So we do dash space bracket. All you need to do is copy what we've done previously, and we'll simply name this manual button, and making sure that ends with our semicolon. And then by doing that manually, it doesn't add it into our .m like it does automatically with our action button and segment control, which we did for the assistant editor. As you can see, we've got an error, and it's saying there's no definition of manual button. So by doing it manually, adding it in, we also have to add it manually into our .m. So I'm just going to paste it in, and then add the parentheses curly brackets on the end. And also in our main.storyboard, just like adding it manually in our .m, it's not added to an object in our interface builder. You can see there's no connection on it, so we can just simply drag a button in and go to our files owner. And make sure you're in our connections inspector, and then drag and drop the connection link over to our new button, and then select one of the many events, which we're going to select touch up inside is what we need for a button, and it's added in our new manually added action onto our button. So there you go, we've added our actions and outlets onto our objects manually and automatically through the assistant editor. And by doing that, we've now given reference to the objects. So all that's left to do is add code to these objects to allow them to perform the tasks which we basically want them to do. So in the next lecture, we create our first application where we're going to be creating and performing our first action throughout our course.